I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, amid German opposition leader Friedrich Merz's visit to Kyiv, we dig into the significance of Bashar al Assad's fall for Russia and Ukraine. We also have an interview with author Jacob Heilbrunn about why some on the political right are attracted to the easy answers that dictators provide.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong. Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, 9th of December, 2 years and 295 days since the full-scale invasion began. I'm joined today by James Kilner in Riga and Francis Dearnley, our assistant comment editor, who should be on holiday but couldn't resist joining the discussion given the weekend's momentous developments in Syria. We're going to be focusing on that extraordinary news today, but first, some quick updates. Despite huge losses, the Institute for the Study of War reports that Russian forces have resumed their offensive operations aimed at seizing the Donbas town of Pokrovsk. They're advancing from the south after successfully widening their salient in that direction. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Russian forces are likely attempting to flank Pokrovsk from the west and force Ukrainian forces to withdraw. The Russian military command initially identified a direct assault on Pokrovsk as a primary offensive effort for its summer-autumn 2024 campaign, but they later amended that after assessing that it would be impossible with a full frontal assault. They're now seeking to capture Ukrainian pockets near Kharkov, Vuhledar and Venetia Novosilka before moving on to Pokrovsk from the south. We're expecting them to level the front line in western Donetsk Oblast in the coming weeks. All of that's happening despite the unsustainable loss of Russian manpower, weapons and equipment. We're also hearing that Ukrainian forces are making some gains near Venetia Novosilka as well as in the Kursk Oblast. Meanwhile, Russian attacks on Ukraine killed at least one person and injured at least 9 over the past day, according to regional authorities. The Ukrainian Air Force said today that Russia launched 2 cruise missiles and 37 drones against Ukraine overnight. In slightly better news, late last week, Ukraine unveiled a new home-manufactured rocket drone called Peklo, which translates as hell. Apparently, it's capable of striking targets 430 miles away. That's more than twice the longest range of missiles supplied by Ukraine's Western allies. The Peklo is made by Ukraine's state arms manufacturer, Ukroboronprom, and is the second such weapon to be launched by Kyiv this year. It comes obviously amid Russia's new weapons, such as the Oreshnik medium-range ballistic missile and the slow rate of Western's arms deliveries, which we've covered on this podcast. Kyiv is now trying to fortify its own domestic capabilities, particularly for those longer-range missiles. And then just finally, for military updates, Ukrainian forces are apparently going to be receiving increased access to Starshield. Now, that's a more secure, encrypted satellite network for Starlink terminals. According to Bloomberg, Ukraine currently has access to Starshield on about 500 terminals, but that will be expanded to 3,000 Starlink terminals, which will be a big boon for Ukraine as they try to secure their communications and tackle Russian cyber interference. Now, over to James Kilner for some geopolitical updates, and then we'll move on to discuss the main subject, Syria.
Hi, Venetia. So the big story over the weekend was this previously unexpected meeting between Trump and Zelensky in Paris. They were in the French capital for the reopening of the Notre-Dame Cathedral, which had burnt down in 2019. Macron had made a big play about making the reopening a big shindig for world leaders, and he'd set up a meeting with Trump and Zelensky on the sidelines of this. So quite a diplomatic coup by Macron, because Trump came out with some of his most forthright comments so far since he won that US election in November, really laying down his sort of wish, his demand to impose a peace deal in Ukraine. This has been building since his victory. We're expecting this to be top of his list of things to do once he is inaugurated as US president at the end of January. And him and Zelensky shared a platform with Macron, and they said, yeah, we want to do this peace deal. So this is a huge change in language from Zelensky. He's really softened his tone since Trump's win. He's moved from saying he will not negotiate with Putin until he's defeated Putin on the battlefield to now on Saturday saying, we can achieve peace through talks. This was a major piece of diplomacy focused on Ukraine, which obviously got overshadowed slightly by the spectacular and rapid events in Syria, but very, very important for your listeners to be aware of. Now, when Trump was talking about, there's another sort of underlying story about this meeting here. When Trump was talking about imposing peace in Ukraine, he was also talking about Ukrainian casualty figures, which the Ukrainian officials have gone out their way to basically to hide from the greater public. They say it's potentially demoralizing for Ukrainians, and they've gone out of their way not to release this data, these figures. They were, as you well know, they're already having major recruitment problems in Ukraine. That's one of the reasons that the Russian forces are inching forward on the front line. But Trump let slip, deliberately or not, we don't know, that Ukraine has suffered 400,000 casualties since the start of the war. That is significantly less than Russia, but it's still a huge amount. He broke this down and said that 43,000 soldiers have been killed and roughly 370,000 soldiers have been injured. So the real cost of the war there coming through from Trump on Saturday. Now, Zelensky, he's clearly trying to get on side with Trump now. And he confirmed this data on Sunday in quite a long post on X, formerly called Twitter. He confirmed this data. So that was also an important moment. That was him saying, fine, our data's now out there and we're just going to have to go along with it. And we can't be seen to be pushing back against Trump, etc. It's too important now. He did put in some caveats. He said that the Ukrainian data was significantly different from the Russian data because they also took into account lightly injured casualty numbers, whereas he said the Russians were only badly injured. So he was saying, actually, the Russian numbers are a lot more than they're giving away. He also said that since September this year, Russia has been losing, in the rough estimate, of 6-1 more soldiers on the front line than Ukraine. That's really a reflection of the intensity of the battles there and Putin's apparent determination to push forward his soldiers ahead of the presumed peace deal that Trump's going to impose. Some interesting stuff coming out of Paris and Kiev over the weekend. The other majorly consequential story on the geopolitical agenda is a story from Romania, where the Romanian Central Election Court cancelled the second round runoff in a presidential election 48 hours before it was meant to be run. And they did this because they said that Russian interference in the first round had twisted the result. They said Russia had set up a bank of 800 different TikTok accounts to bombard TikTok, which is obviously a highly influential social media channel in Romania, with adverts in favor of the pro-Russia candidate, a guy called Călin Georgescu, who came from almost out of nowhere to win the first round. He's a conspiracy theorist, doesn't believe man's ever landed on the moon, doesn't believe in the COVID pandemic, pro-Russia, etc. He came from virtually nowhere to win the first round and really shock the Romanian establishment. He was due to face off against a sort of centre-right candidate in the first presidential second round runoff, not to have featured a social democrat candidate for 3 decades. So big deal there, massive deal that an EU country, Romania, has cancelled an entire presidential election because of what it says is Russian interference. As we know, the Kremlin has these hybrid strategies to unsettle and disrupt what's going on in Europe, and this very much includes meddling in elections. Moldova had an election a few weeks previously, obviously bordered, but it sits outside the EU and much more easily influenced by the Kremlin than Romania because part of former Soviet Union, large ethnic Russian minority, this sort of thing. And the Kremlin was able to funnel lots of cash into Moldova and literally buy votes. That has not been happening in Romania as far as I understand, but clearly enough going on there for the authorities to get nervous about the authenticity of this election and to take the hugely unprecedented step of actually cancelling it. So another very interesting story there, Venetia.
Thanks so much, James. And there's just one more thing we should probably mention, which is happening today. Germany's Conservative opposition leader, Friedrich Merz, who polls suggest will be the country's next chancellor to replace Olaf Scholz, actually arrived in Kyiv this morning. He said that he wants to learn about the current state of defence in the country. He has advocated for Germany to give its Taurus missiles to Ukraine, something that Scholz has repeatedly refused to do. If he does win the election that we're expecting in January next year, that would be a huge boon for Ukraine. He's much more hawkish on Russia than Olaf Scholz, so that could be interesting to watch, and we'll report more on that tomorrow. So let's move on to Syria. I'm going to start with a brief recap of what's happened, and if people want more details, I would suggest checking out our sister podcast, Battle Lines, where we'll also be covering the events in Syria and speaking to the war photographer Paul Conroy. But let's focus on the impact on Russia and Ukraine. So a brief recap. 2011, massive pro-democracy protests in Syria leads to an all-out civil war after Bashar al Assad refuses to take into account any of the demands of protesters for more democratic elections, more transparency, more civil society involvement. The war disintegrates and expands across the whole country. In 2015, Russia intervenes to support the Assad regime. He starts carpet bombing cities such as Aleppo, and the rebels are put on the back foot. By 2020, you get a ceasefire stalemate emerging. And that was until 2 weeks ago, when rebels led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham took Aleppo. And this was an Islamist group with its roots in al-Qaeda and ISIS. They have been controlling an area in the northeast of Syria around Idlib, but they broke out of that area. They managed to seize Aleppo, and then they also managed to seize Hama, Homs, and other rebel groups from the south of Syria managed to enter Damascus. Assad fled to Moscow over the weekend, where he's claimed asylum along with his family. The Syrians have entered the presidential palace, this feared prison called Sednaya. They've released political prisoners. There are scenes in the street of people using a statue of Bashar al Assad as a sledge, hitting a statue of Hafez al-Assad, the father, with shoes. And we've seen the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Abu Muhammad al-Golani, giving a speech in the Umayyad Mosque in the centre of Damascus, hugely symbolic, and saying that he will not persecute minorities and that this is a new dawn for Syria and they're purifying Syria. So why talk about this on Ukraine the latest? Well, as we mentioned, this is a regime that the Kremlin has helped prop up, and it also has two crucial military bases in Syria. James, can you tell us a bit more about the relationship between Russia and Syria before Assad was kicked out, and why this is so important to Putin?
In 2015, Putin really saw an opportunity to project his power and influence on the world stage. Assad was losing the civil war and was begging Putin for help. And Putin acquiesced and sent in his air force, which ruthlessly carpet-bombed rebels, etc., killing thousands of people and helping turn the war in Assad's favour. In return, so Kremlin already had control of a naval base in Syria, but as a thank you for helping carpet bomb rebels and then sending in soldiers on the ground, starting with the Wagner mercenaries that we know so well in Ukraine, Assad gave Putin an airbase on the coast as well. So Putin, in return for showing off a bit of might, a bit of air force power, was able to expand this naval base on the Syrian coast and also earned an airbase. Now, for Putin, this was an absolute winning scenario. He'd been desperate to show off how reformed and powerful his army was, and he'd been desperate to project Russian might around the world. And this was his opportunity. So he was able to, suddenly there were videos of Russian and US soldiers rubbing up against each other at a UN General Assembly meeting a year or so later, because Putin, if you remember, was absolutely global pariah at this point. His forces had invaded Donbass region. They shot down a Malaysian airliner, etc. He was absolutely shunned. They'd taken control of Crimea, all this sort of thing. Barack Obama, who absolutely did not want to meet Putin, had to meet Putin a year later at the UN General Assembly in 2016, partly because Putin was now projecting Russia's influence more globally through this war in Syria. And specifically, these two bases were important. Putin had designs to influence what was going on in Africa, in Libya, Sudan, and in the Sahel region, where he wanted to foment coups d'etats against Western-backed governments. And he was able to do this. He was able to project this influence to put forces into Africa to help his proxy allies over there through these two bases in Syria, which became staging posts for the Air Force, firstly for the Russian Air Force, and then secondly for the Navy. This is Russia's only warm water port. This is our only port in the Mediterranean. It became its main repair and replenishment centre for its Navy, and a very important staging post for Africa, as was the airbase.
How important were these bases for the war in Ukraine?
So the bases for the war in Ukraine, they were seen by the Kremlin as guarding its sort of southern flank. So they regarded these two bases as important for deterring any NATO warships, aircraft carriers, etc., getting involved in doing anything in Ukraine from that part of the Mediterranean, which is important. It was also, Russia was sending resupplies to its naval base in Syria, Tartus naval base in Syria, stocking up with food and weapons and sending weapons, etc., to then funnel onto Africa. And then those ships were returning with shells and other Cold War kit, which was then being able to use in Ukraine. And also, as we know, Wagner mercenaries, they really trained in Syria. It was one of their training grounds before being deployed to Ukraine. And the same can be said for the airbase in Syria. Russia used that as a training. The bombing runs that it used against Syria and its sort of flight patterns, the airbase in Syria was also important for that.
And we're seeing some reports that Russia might be starting to evacuate some of its equipment and weapons. I note that the Institute for Study of War has seen some satellite images that suggest that there are defence systems, such as the S-300 and S-400, being taken along the Latakia-Tartus highway. So it might be that Russia feels that those bases are insecure. They put out a statement saying that the rebels had promised not to attack them. But we've also had conflicting reports from other parts of the rebel group that no matter what is decided on high, what happens on the ground might be a different matter. So I think a lot is in flux now. I'm going to pass over to Francis now. What are your thoughts on everything that's been developing in Syria, Francis, and how this might impact the war in Ukraine and Russia's geopolitical heft?
Well, thanks, Venetia. Long-time listeners will know that often when I'm supposed to be on holiday, something major happens, whether it be a stray missile striking Poland or the counteroffensive starting. And whilst I'm not dialing in from somewhere too eccentric this time, I do think the events of the past 72 hours qualify as historic and hugely significant for the war, hence why I was keen to join for a few minutes today. So thanks for squeezing me in. I remember when I was at university, one of my professors mooted the question whether Hitler lost the war in a weekend. And he was citing the events of a single 48-hour period in December 1941, when it became clear that German forces were overstretched and unable to take Moscow, and, of course, the Führer's disastrous decision to support Japan and declare war on the US following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, for right or wrong, I keep returning to that thesis over the past day or so, because I think two major events collided this weekend, which could be extremely important for the direction of travel in the coming months, perhaps even for the entire war itself. So we should mark this moment. The rapid collapse of the Assad regime and, of course, of the significant Russian influence in the Middle East James was just talking about is the most obvious. It is a humiliating setback for a country that sees itself as a world player. So much of the clout that Moscow has on the world stage is due to the perceived influence it has over Syria and Iran. In the past year, of course, Iran has been embarrassed time and time again following October the 7th, and its proxies severely depleted in power. And now Syria has gone from the picture entirely, its regime potentially forging new alliances with entirely different powers. It's underappreciated, I think, that the Syrian rebels we're speaking about now have been so strongly supported by Turkey. Turkey may be about to replace Russia as the key broker in that country. Turkey, of course, being, despite everything, still a NATO member. It seems quite clear that the mood in Ankara at the moment is that many of the thousands of Syrian refugees currently in Turkey may now be able to go home. So Russia loses influence there for one, but Moscow's allies will also have watched what's taken place with horror. seeing that Putin will abandon those he calls his friends when push really comes to shove. He walks away. That's hardly reassuring if you're a country that's currently relying on Moscow support, whether it be in Europe or indeed in Africa or the Middle East. Now, as an aside, I remain convinced that this would apply in Ukraine too, that if Putin truly felt he was in danger at home because of the war, he could sell an honourable, very much in inverted commas, way out, claiming that he gave NATO a bloody nose and that the West will now think twice before ever upsetting Russia again. But that's a side point. All of that pales in insignificance to the profound shift in the diplomatic and geopolitical mood music that we've seen as a consequence of the collapse of one of the Middle East's most brutal dictatorships. As the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk put it yesterday, quote, "The events in Syria have made the world realize once again, or at least they should, that even the most cruel regime may fail and that Russia and its allies can be defeated." It has given a lift, Venetia, a tangible lift to those who've argued for a long time that dictatorships appear strong until they suddenly aren't. And the implications for that are obvious, but perhaps they're most important at this moment. Donald Trump is about to return to the White House. This is a man who we know backs winners. Russia has just lost and lost badly. And he said that himself, Trump. He posted about it over the weekend. If the momentum is perceived to be with Ukraine over Russia, he is unlikely to want to favor Russia over Kyiv. And that brings me to the other hugely important moment of the weekend for me. And that's the meeting James was just talking about between Zelensky and Trump, brokered by Macron at the grand reopening of Notre-Dame Cathedral. The body language was evidently warm. And whilst we don't know whether Trump wearing the colours of the Ukrainian flag in terms of his suit and tie choice was a coincidence or not, it was still a striking image and one I can imagine causing quite a little bit of nerves and anxiety in the Kremlin, as was the fact that they spoke for around 45 minutes when world leaders were literally queuing up to speak to the president-elect. Macron, it has to be said, played an absolute blinder in bringing them together at this moment. Almost enough for me to dust off my beret and become Francophile Francis once more. Not only did the meeting take place, but Trump would have witnessed the way Zelensky was applauded inside the cathedral when he arrived. Again, Trump backs winners. He backs popular figures. And Trump even went up to Zelensky again after the meeting and shook his hand publicly with the other world leaders. Zelensky's messaging too, as you spoke about earlier, is that he's willing to end the war and is willing to publish those alleged casualty figures. That is attractive to Trump and will make Zelensky more sympathetic now. And crucially, when, as many speculate, Russia refuses to negotiate sensibly. That's when it may become clearer that it is Moscow which is the great impediment to peace in Europe, not Ukraine. And that may be the moment that Washington decides it needs to support Kyiv more strongly, more robustly, in order to give it leverage and ultimately perhaps score more successes on the battlefield to eventually bring Moscow to the table and willing to talk. We're not there yet. A lot of that is hypothetical. But I find myself, honestly, more optimistic today about the likely outcomes for Ukraine than I have for many months. I could be proven wrong, of course, but what a time, what a moment for Russia to lose a major ally. Could this weekend have been a turning point? Could this have been the moment that marks the high watermark of Putin's months-long momentum? Maybe, just maybe.
Thank you so much, Francis, and we appreciate you squeezing us in even when you're on holiday. James, do you want to come in with any final thoughts on that or anything else we've been talking about today?
Yeah, thanks, Venetia. Really interesting and eloquent as usual, Francis. I would challenge the concept that Putin has just abandoned an ally. That's not exactly my reading of it. I think he had no choice, actually. I think it's important not to over egg that. I think basically he was left absolutely dumbfounded and bewildered and angry and frustrated, and, as you say, humiliated by the collapse of Assad's forces in the face of the rebel attacks. And I think we know the Russian Air Force did do some bombing runs, etc., to try and slow it down, but the utter collapse of the Assad regime made it impossible for Russia to single-handedly defend it against the rebels. It didn't have many men on the ground. It had an air force that could do something, but it couldn't really do anything else. I don't think it's entirely correct to say that he abandoned Syria, and I think that's doubly so when you think that he's actually given Assad refuge. He's allowed Assad to fly into Moscow into exile, which brings me on to another point. So the very optics of Putin giving Assad, this murderous tyrant, a place to live happily for the rest of his life, really locks down Putin's place as an utter pariah in the world, if he wasn't already. So that, I think, is an important fallout from this whole story. And I've taken a bit of reading into, from me, through the depths of the Russian media, is that there's genuine anger and irritation in Moscow and the Kremlin, it seems, at how Iran has behaved, which is very important for the war in Ukraine. As we know, Iran has become a major ally of Russia, sending missiles and drones, etc. There is genuine anger at what is perceived to be a backstab from Iran against the Kremlin. The Russian commentators close to the Kremlin have been complaining that Iran failed to provide Assad's forces with the backup that they needed to fight back against the rebels, and therefore they didn't even support the Russian airstrikes, etc. They cut and run. And that has left a very sour taste in Russians. And that could be potentially one of the most consequential outcomes of this whole thing. If that alliance between Iran and Russia starts to fracture because they've lost their shared interest in the Middle East now, there's obviously some bad blood around it. If that starts to fracture, then there is more hope for Ukraine, etc. So I think a couple of small but important points there.
Just to quickly respond to that, I think James is absolutely right that in reality, Putin's options were very limited in terms of what he could reasonably have done to try and shore up the Assad regime once the momentum was so clearly with the rebels. But the perception, of course, is that he has left Assad pretty high and dry, and that he was slow to respond in the early phases, which itself is revealing, right? That Russia is extremely stretched at the moment. If it weren't in Ukraine, then maybe it would have had more capacity to do more in supporting its allies. But the fact is, its forces are thin in Ukraine, they're thin elsewhere in the Middle East, and they were especially thin in Syria, hence why, of course, we're in the situation that we are. So again, I think it's just an important point to remember of how all of this is interconnected, and it ain't a good look for Moscow.
I think I would just want to add that it's interesting that this comes at the same time as Russia seems to be expanding its military presence in Libya, another victim, I think we can say, of the Arab Spring, where pro-democracy protests managed to oust Muammar Gaddafi, another long-time dictator, but the country quickly fell into instability and has been fractured by rival groups claiming power over different parts of the country. Certainly serves as a warning lesson for Syria. But Russia has been embedding itself more there. It's got a partnership with Libyan warlord General Khalifa Haftar, and it's been expanding runways and trying to expand as part of its expansion of its footprint in Africa. Our senior foreign correspondent, Sophia Yan, wrote a story about what satellite images are showing about that. Just interesting to note that Russia may have had this blow in Syria, and it remains to be seen what will happen to its airbase and its port in Tartus, but it's not the end for Russia. Russia is still expanding other places and has lots of fingers and lots of pies, shall we say. Coming up after the break, why are some politicians on the political right attracted to the easy answers that dictators provide? Francis sat down with author Jacob Heilbrunn to find out. Welcome back. Now, over to Francis Dearnley for the rest of this episode.
Last week, Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News host, went to Russia to speak with Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov.
He'd previously been to Moscow to speak to Vladimir Putin, and the interview was very widely criticised as playing up narratives that Russia has been very keen to push on the United States and other Western countries about the origins of the war and indeed how it may end. But the criticisms that have come, particularly from the left and the right, regarding Tucker Carlson's appearance there, and indeed those who perhaps sympathise with some of the narratives around Putin, are quite often missing the fact that this is not an isolated or new tradition. There is already a history of a sympathy for isolationism, or indeed going further than that, in the United States. And so I'm really pleased to be chatting to Jacob Heilbrunn today, who is the editor of The National Interest. And he's just written a book called America Last, about the history of the right and its sympathy, romance for foreign dictatorships. Now, The National Interest, for those who aren't familiar, is a hugely distinguished foreign policy magazine, founded in 1985. And indeed, it was the magazine which published the Kellogg essay that, of course, is now very much discussed in him trying to offer a way forward for Ukraine before his appointment of being its special envoy. But Jacob's career at the magazine began when, in the very first issue, while he was working there, featured Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, perhaps the most significant essay of modern times. So, Jacob, thank you very much for your time. We're going to get into the modern examples, perhaps, of a sympathy for dictators, or at least extreme isolationism, in the American context later on. But first of all, let's go back to the beginning of this as a consistent movement. Let's go back to the First World War. Why were people so sympathetic in the US to Kaiser Wilhelm?
It was H.L. Mencken and George Sylvester Viereck, both who were extremely influential intellectuals, and Mencken was a famous columnist for the Baltimore Sun, who plumped for Kaiser Wilhelm. They said that Woodrow Wilson and the liberals had it all wrong, that in fact Prussian autocracy was something to be admired and emulated in the United States itself. Mencken himself wrote a long piece for The Atlantic, which then was one of our leading intellectual journals, explaining what it would look like if Prussian autocracy conquered America. He said it would be a good thing for the United States, and he denounced interventionist liberals and said that democracy was not only not something we shouldn't be fighting for, but it was also something that should be shunned. Prussia had it right. Edwardian England had it completely wrong. Mencken and other conservatives denounced Great Britain as a hostile power to the United States, as one that had inveigled us under the pretense of liberal democracy to side with it in World War I. These American conservatives championed Kaiser Wilhelm and Prussia, just as they now champion Vladimir Putin.
How popular were they as figures? Was this a fringe movement on the right, or was this actually very mainstream?
The right itself, intellectually, was in an embryonic state around World War I. It was forming itself, and it became much more influential after World War I because there was widespread disillusionment with the war, much as there was in Great Britain as well. The idea was that this fight for liberal democracy had only emboldened the munitions makers, that it had not brought peace to Europe, that nationalism was running amok, and so forth. So there was widespread disillusionment both among liberals and conservatives. The conservative movement, in some ways, in the United States, founded itself in opposition to liberal democracy and to World War I.
Fascinating. So when we think of the First World War and the birth of ideologies, of course, the one that really everybody knows about is the birth of Bolshevism and the birth of the Soviet Union. Why is it that this tradition, and we'll get to, of course, what happens in the 1930s in a moment, why is this less known in the public consciousness, do you think?
Because, we're very familiar with the saga of the political pilgrims on the left, My late friend Paul Hollander, who's a well-known sociologist, in fact wrote a book called Political Pilgrims, charting the history of people who worshipped various communist regimes, beginning with Bolshevism, then Mao's China, Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam, Fidel Castro's Cuba, Nicaragua in the 1980s. All of these were held up as foreign utopias that should serve as a model for the United States. So I don't think much attention has been focused on conservatives. And in fact, I myself assumed, having grown up with Ronald Reagan, who I admired, I thought, well, conservatives are happy with the state of the United States. So they really have nothing to complain about. So they're not gallivanting around the globe looking for these foreign utopias to supplant American democracy. However, with the rise of Trump, Donald Trump, and this faction on the right that admires both Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, and Vladimir Putin, I began to realize that there is, in fact, a longer tradition. I started to look more closely. So the hard right has, in fact, fallen prey to the same affliction that the left did.
We'll come to the modern examples of this in a moment, but I'm interested if we carry on through the timeline, as it were. So we get into the 1920s and the 1930s, and there are many figures in the American right who are sympathetic to Mussolini, just as there were in Europe too. Where does that come from? Is it a similar phenomenon as what we saw in the First World War? Is there something else going on? Because that's a period of much more instability in contrast to the First World War period.
It's an outgrowth out of World War I, because there was a wave of revisionist history that I point to that grew up also on the right. And there were figures such as Albert J. Nock and others. There was a magazine called The Freeman. I mean, this is the early history of the American right. But it morphs in the 1930s because there are criticisms of liberal democracy in the 1920s. In 1924, Congress passed a draconian anti-immigration bill. All of these things were in the ether in the 1920s. And when you have Mussolini, here seems to be someone who's espousing what? Family values. He calls for natalist policies in the Italian parliament, and in fact institutes a bachelor's tax, a special tax if you're a bachelor. You're supposed to produce babies. He wanted something like 65 million Italians by 1948. That was the idea. Mussolini is hierarchical. There's order. Yes, there may be a little bit of violence, but just as the left said, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. I think that was the same view on the right. There are also figures such as William Randolph Hearst, who was the movie mogul and had a newspaper empire, was also sympathetic to Hitler and struck deals with him whereby the Nazis would run newsreels, Hearst's newsreels, in Germany. So there's a financial element and there's an ideological element to it. And a lot of politicians on the right in the United States also were sympathetic to the Nazi regime because they thought it was bringing order. I point out in my book that Herbert Hoover traveled shortly before the Anschluss with Austria, or the annexation, in March 1938, and said that he met with Hitler in the Reichschancellery in Berlin and said, this is a man essentially we can do business with, and he can impose order on these restive nationalities in Central Europe.
It's so interesting. And I wonder as well, the role of the Wall Street crash and the economic fragility exposed in the United States. Does that appeal to order, to strength, to the dictatorial, come in part from the chaos sown by that event?
Well, since we're delving so much into history, yes, 100%. The conservatives interpreted the New Deal and the rise of Franklin Roosevelt as the real totalitarian threat. They didn't see Adolf Hitler as a threat. They believed that fascism had emerged in the United States, and they also tarred many of Roosevelt's Jewish advisors with this label as well. One of the themes on the right was that Roosevelt was being manipulated by a Jewish cabal of financiers and so forth and other advisors. So Roosevelt became the enemy for the right. And that is also why you have the rise of America First in the late 1930s and the opposition to entry into World War II. It's seen as another quixotic liberal quest. Instead of attacking Adolf Hitler, we should be allying ourselves with him against the Bolshevik threat. Now, of course, you know that these similar arguments percolated in London as well. The appeasers were all making the same arguments.
And appeasers on the left and the right, which of course we see in the war in Ukraine context now, which is on the far left. You hear them speaking in the same playbook as the harder right or the further to the right in the United States, this sort of tradition of isolationism and sympathy for the idea that somehow the American population, and indeed this has echoes in Europe as well, are being dragged into something against their will. And I think it's interesting seeing some of the rhetoric from figures like Tucker Carlson in that context. But before, as I say, we get to the present period, I'm really interested to see how we go through the rest of the century. So Second World War happens. Does it wake many of those figures who were isolationists before the war up to the horrors once they suddenly realise what's been taking place? Is there a retribution, as it were, for the mistakes that were made in that ideological sense when they saw the horrors that were being endured in Europe? Or actually were people still pretty strongly committed to the belief that the war was a bad idea?
There were some more moderate figures, such as Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who saw reality and recognized that World War II was an essential battle against the greatest evil mankind has ever faced. However, a number of these conservatives did not bat an eyelash. And I, again, show in the book, they're meeting in 43 and 44. What do? They concoct conspiracy theories. Roosevelt was sitting with his dog Fala in his lap and had plotted the attack on Pearl Harbor. Another one, after World War II, these conspiracy theories flourished, and they were, I point out that Regnery Publishing, which is an influential publishing house on the right, published a lot of conspiracy theories about World War II. Another one who figured in this was Joseph McCarthy, who argued, as I showed in the book, that the real war criminals had actually been American soldiers. He claimed that they had exercised victor's justice after World War II, that Jewish lawyers in a Nazi war crimes trial at Malmedy, Belgium, where about slightly over 100 American soldiers had surrendered there, and they were massacred by an SS division led by a man named Joachim Pieper. And his fellow soldiers were tried after World War II and found guilty. Now, McCarthy, who was the premier American demagogue, argued, in fact, that vengeful Jewish lawyers had trumped this all up. It didn't go anywhere. Congress investigated, and McCarthy made a lot of noise. But again, it's another sign to me of how fixated the right was with trying to exculpate Nazi Germany. Another person was Frida Utley, who grew up in Great Britain, was a prominent communist, lived in the Soviet Union, and then became a far-right figure, emigrated to the United States, and also hooked up with Joseph McCarthy. And she actually wrote a book in which she said that American war crimes in Dresden were as bad or worse than anything that the Nazis had perpetrated in the death camps. So what I do point out in the book is that the origins of Holocaust revisionism, sadly, are on the right. You do see this, again, formative writings from 45 through 50, where the right pretty much takes the side of Nazi Germany.
This movement within the right, therefore, is eventually, of course, over the course of the Cold War, put into the foreground by Ronald Reagan. How is he able to do that if, in your view, this is pretty mainstream on certain elements of the right?
I don't want to exaggerate. What happened in the 1950s is that with the rise of William F. Buckley Jr., who founded National Review, there were elements of this always flitting around. But he himself was not an apologist for Nazism, and he did try to clean up the right. And he did, to a large extent. So Reagan himself was a product of the New Deal. Let's not forget, he was a Democrat. He admired Franklin Roosevelt. I firmly believe that Reagan inherited or imbibed the sunny optimism of FDR and channeled it in a constructive direction. Now, what we're seeing today is a backlash against all of that and a reversion of the right to its original incarnation. So it may sound paradoxical, but what Trump, Tucker Carlson, and others represent is actually more consistent with the history of conservatism. It's just not something we would consider a salubrious history.
It's very interesting because that, as I say, and as you mentioned there, it goes against what is considered the mainstream point of view, is the right is more hawkish and the left is more cautious, so we say, about foreign interventionism for all sorts of reasons. But it's interesting that you're arguing that this is actually, we've lived through a period of aberration. But the reason we're having this conversation now, of course, is I mentioned Tucker Carlson earlier, and of course we've seen many voices pretty cock-a-hoop about the election of President Trump, who, let's say at the very least, if we're being generous, are more sceptical about the dangers of American interventionism. They're not all extremists, but this view has been, I think, more commonly articulated in the past year or so. So how do you see these figures slotting into this? Is it a direct straight line, or do you think that this is actually something that is quite a new phenomenon?
I don't think it's new, but I should put in a caveat. Their concerns about interventionism are not misplaced. They are not ipso facto illegitimate or even wrong. We saw what happened with George W. Bush in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and that is what many of these people, a number of whom I know, some of whom are my friends, some of whom write for the national interest, but they have been, J.D. Vance, for example, served in Iraq. It's not like they just dreamed this up ab ovo. I mean, there is a basis for caution. However, they have overlearned the lesson now. It is symptomatic of the left after Vietnam saying, oh, no, we can't intervene anywhere. All you heard for 30 years from the Democrats was, oh, this is going to be another new Vietnam. No, it's not. Sending arms to the Contras was not going to embroil the United States in a new Vietnam. We are not putting American troops in harm's way in Ukraine. They are taking these lessons from the Middle East and just imposing them on Ukraine. And that's where I get off the train. I think they've gone way too far. And the danger, of course, is that they then end up exculpating Putin for his war crimes.
It's interesting, though, beyond foreign policy, how on a sort of deeper, almost civilizational level, something else is going on here, because we're seeing a sort of profound skepticism in the idea of the West itself, you might say, in certain elements of popular culture, and often figures from the right will point at the left and blame them. They'll point and say it's woke and that this is undermining our society. And so therefore, it seems that there are some figures who find the security and strength, as fickle as it may be in reality, but the appearance of it in figures like Putin as extremely attractive. And I wonder whether you can comment a little bit on that. What's going on when people from, say, the Christian right look at a figure like Putin and say he's defending Christendom?
Well, they've been duped into believing that this man who is a communist and an atheist is somehow standing up for Western civilization or Christian values, all of which he is flagrantly violating in Ukraine, where he is attempting to extirpate a nation. This isn't just a land grab. He's stealing children from the country to try and destroy its future. Closer to Adolf Hitler than it is to anything else. So I wish that these conservatives who admire Orban and Putin would look at reality and what these men really represent. They do not represent gallant virtues that we should be seeking to emulate. In fact, if anything, we know that Putin is running a crime syndicate in Russia. That is in essence what this regime is. Again, not totally different from the Nazis. We tend to forget that even as profound as the hatred of the Jews was, it was also a way of earning money, of stripping people of assets. And so I worry that we have gone back to the future in so many ways, because what you were saying earlier about Tucker Carlson's arguments, yeah, there's nothing new about any of this. You can go back to the 1930s and find Father Coughlin and others making word for word almost the same arguments about Hitler that he does about Putin.
It's a sort of forgotten history, the connections that you're making here, and I think it is really interesting to reflect upon them. And can you draw some of the lines between the way people were speaking about fascism as defending bastions of traditional forces versus this idea of the liberal values of the 20th century, which, to your point earlier on, many on the right thought were harmful? Can you relay some of the things that people were saying about Hitler and Mussolini that they found attractive about them, given the chaos that they perceived as taking place in their own societies at that time?
Yes, it's very interesting. So when Mussolini did the March on Rome, we had an ambassador there named Richard Washburn Childs, who wrote extensively for the Hearst Press in the United States and helped sanitize Mussolini's image. And what he did was, so remember in the 1920s, it's the Great Gatsby era, the liquor is flowing, the market is roaring, the flappers have come out.
It's decadent would be the word that would be described.
The same way that Weimar was in Berlin. So what did he say? He said Mussolini is, this is a great leader. He's cracked down on all of this. This is what we need in the United States. We need someone who instills Catholic virtues in society. There was a lot of admiration as well for Francisco Franco from the same grounds. I talk about extensively about a New York businessman named Merwin K. Hart, who was a classmate of Franklin Roosevelt's at Harvard. And Hart wrote a book about Spain called Look at Spain, which was that Franco had cracked down on unions, he had instilled religiosity, and that we should be backing Franco. And they, in fact, held rallies for Franco in New York. Again, tens of thousands of people attended these events. They were on the front page of the New York Times. It's not like we've forgotten who these people were, but at the time they were not marginal.
Interesting. Well, history is back today, I think it's fair to say, but you were, as I mentioned earlier on, influential in publishing Francis Fukuyama's The End of History essay, which, of course, has been one of the most widely commented perhaps the most widely commented essay of the last few decades. So when you reflect on the end of history and what Mr. Fukuyama was writing, do you think he was completely wrong?
No. I think the gravamen of his argument was correct. There is no alternative to liberal democracy. He was right about that. What he, of course, woefully underestimated was the resistance to it and the backlash that would emerge. There is nothing inevitable in history. Sometimes these retrograde forces have taken on a power that at the time, I myself, when that essay was published, was in my mid-20s. I never would have thought that at that moment, with the optimism that was in the air, that you would encounter that profound a return to the past. But maybe 1848 was followed by 1849. Maybe that's what we're witnessing today. I'm still bullish on Western democracy and free trade and capitalism. I think these are the motors of modern history. What we're witnessing are efforts to try and retard them. But there's no question in my mind that free trade, capitalism have brought us unprecedented prosperity in the West. My fear is that we're going to throw it all away with a self-inflicted wound.
There is something a little bit more complex, though, going on in the book that followed that essay by Francis Fukuyama, because he was basically arguing that, yes, it may be the end of the ideological struggles of the 20th century were over and liberal democracy had won. But his other point to that was that liberal democracies have this inherent malaise that makes people anxious and then begin to tear their own societies apart. If you were to agree with that argument, could you not say that that's what we're seeing today? That to a degree we had the Cold War end, we had this period of liberal golden age, and then all of a sudden people are now tearing their own societies apart instead, and that we're reverting back to history as a result. Do you agree with that?
I mean, that's certainly what it looks like. Even in Germany, which kept talking about nie wieder, never again, we have the alternative for Germany. This party is roaring in the polls, particularly in the eastern states of Germany. And they don't engage in open Holocaust denial, but they do try and sanitize Nazi phrases, and it's virulently anti-immigrant, and it is a reversion to the past. So, yeah, there's something going on. Plus, now that Trump has been elected for the second time, you can't say it's a fluke. You could say it was the first time, but when he got reelected and everyone knows exactly what he stands for, something has changed.
Well, we were talking about Francis Fukuyama before we came on air, not just in relation to the essay, but also thinking about it in the context of the horrors that we've seen in this war and the ability seemingly of many politicians and many ordinary people too, it has to be said, who have, for whatever reason, buried their heads in the sand about the atrocities that are taking place at the hands of the Russians in Ukraine. And listeners will know I've got this thesis connected to what Jan Karski argued in the 1940s context around the Holocaust, which is that it is actually quite impossible for people to conceive beyond a certain boundary of what they expected their reality to be like. And so in the 1940s, it was almost impossible for people to believe that there were death camps, even when you had the facts in front of you. And maybe because of Fukuyama's essay, there were a generation of people who were taught, like I was, that this kind of thing would be impossible. I wonder whether that's fair and whether you would agree or disagree with me on that we are actually, in a way, blinkered by our culture into thinking that this would be impossible, and therefore that's making us inept in our response to the horror.
There may be among some on the older generation on the left and the right that think like that. But, if you've read a lot of history, I think the conceit always was that prosperous economies would avert war and that these economic ties, I think that's what Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, believed. And it stems from Kissinger to some degree, but it doesn't seem to work. The military ideological imperative does seem to triumph. And the problem that Europe is facing right now is that Putin is willing to ramp up his military spending to an extraordinary degree. And you have these democracies that are responsive to their citizenry, and they want their welfare benefits and their old age pensions. They don't want any of that tampered with. That's the third rail in the United States and in Europe. That is what we face. That's not really very different, though, is it, from the 1920s and 30s? Let's face it, no one wanted to acknowledge what Hitler was really up to. There's always the path of least resistance, and that's what we tend to take.
I think that's a very fair argument, and it's something that when this war is over, we need to do some more reading and thinking about. But, Jacob, it's, for some, a very worrying time in the United States. I mean, there's been so much talk about this being the birth of a new fascism. Others would say that this is completely over-egged. Trump, he's not a fascist. He's perhaps something of a populist, but really he doesn't belong to this dictatorial tradition, and that a lot of it is fake news that's been put on him by his enemies. Where do you stand on this as somebody who knows a lot of these figures that are around him?
I've always been chary of using the word fascism because it's so loaded, and I don't know that it actually explains anything. Trump certainly is a demagogue with dangerous instincts. He has talked about illegal immigrants poisoning the blood of the United States. He's talked about prosecuting and executing people like the former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley. He's talked about executing Liz Cheney. Is it bluster? Is it for real? I suppose he's always testing the waters to see how far he can push things. I think the U.S., am I frozen like a rabbit? No. I think the United States can survive Trump.
Mm. And those who are around him then, specifically on foreign policy, what's your instinct about the direction of travel? Because there are, as we speak right now, talks taking place between the Ukrainians and the Trump camp. We've seen Keith Kellogg appointed, who is more hawkish than people expected. What do you think the orthodox view is going to be in the Trump camp with regards to the war in Ukraine? Is it going to be more or is it going to be less?
It's looking like it's going to be more hawkish than we thought, to my surprise and relief. Now, it could be totally wrong because Trump is the decider, as George W. Bush called himself. Trump gets to make the decisions. But Marco Rubio was one of the senators who pushed for the bill, declaring that a president could not simply willfully extract the United States from NATO. Rubio is a hawk. Mike Waltz is a hawk. So the picture is much more mixed than people would have assumed. And Putin himself could antagonize Trump, I think, because I don't think Putin has the slightest interest in any peace deal. Why would he? He thinks he's winning. He looks like he's winning. He may be winning. So why stop? He wants all of Ukraine.
Jacob, it's been a really interesting and wide-reaching conversation, and I know we could go on for hours speaking on just one single decade that's in your book. But what would your parting words be to listeners who are, many of which will be perhaps unfamiliar with some of this history, but we were reflecting on the situation now in Ukraine? Are there any thoughts that are on your mind that should be on ours but may not be?
I remain an optimist because the history that I chronicle in the book is essentially a counter-history. The United States did, in fact, enter World War II and play a important, if not pivotal, role in helping to defeat the Third Reich. And all of these ideas are inherently fringe. They are anti-democratic and anti-liberal, in essence, in the classical liberal sense, which is why Trump is so opposed as well, not just to immigration, but also to free trade. The message from my book is forewarned is forearmed. There's no reason to cower or cringe. The ideas that have propelled the West have not been invalidated.
Jacob, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware that we exist. You can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk, and we do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.